drone layers worth saving and how? Okay, so no. In general, no. We'll just get right to the point. The vast majority of the time, I do not recommend trying to save hives that have become drone laying hives. Now, there are some caveats there and some background there. So if you're in a hurry, you can just stop the video right here and don't save it and move on. If you want to hear some historical context, then we'll get into that. So there's two reasons hives can begin to be what we call drone laying hives. One could be a queen has failed. She has run out of sperm or she never mated properly. So either she's really old or she never mated properly in the first place. And instead of laying worker eggs, she's laying unfertilized eggs, which develop into drones. So when you see that in a hive, it typically you still see a lot of brood and even maybe a decent brood pattern. You might see two or three frames mostly full of drone brood instead of worker bee brood. And there might still be some worker bee brood mixed in, but you can see that 90+% of the brood in the hive is that really rough, bumpy, bullet shaped drone brood instead of worker bee brood. So when I see a lot of it, if I'm seeing multiple frames in a decent brood pattern, I typically assume that there's a queen in there somewhere that has either failed or never made it properly. If that's the case, if that's the case, then it's a little bit more worth it potentially to try to save it. So in that case, I would go through the hive. I would look for a queen. If I find her, then I would kill her. And then I would add some fresh frames of worker bee brood from a different hive and add a new queen. And it usually works. So now if you can't find that old queen, then often what I do is I just shake all the bees out and use that equipment elsewhere. Store it in wax moth crystals or if it's full of brood, then I usually freeze it to kill everything and then put those thawed brood frames back in a different hive to let them clean it out. But you've got to find that old queen. Otherwise, there's no point in trying to save the hive. Now, if the brood is, another big thing with an old queen, you're typically only going to have one or two eggs per cell. So that's a well, huge indicator that it's an old failing queen or a new queen that didn't mate. There's only one or two eggs per cell, and they're going to be at the bottom of the cell properly placed. Now, if you're going through the hive and there's just a scattering of drone brood all over the hive, it's not like there's a couple nice, decently compact frames of drone brood. It's just scattered all over the place, and you've got 5, 6, 12, 15 eggs per cell, and they're all around the edge of the cell, on the bottom, on the sides, etc. That is typically laying workers. So that is when the hive has lost their queen and they've been queenless for a long time. And the worker bees have actually started laying because, when you have a queen in a hive, she's emitting a pheromone. And one of the big roles of that pheromone is to suppress the worker bees and prevent them from laying because worker bees can lay. They just don't because of that queen pheromone. Now, when she's gone for weeks and they were not successful at raising a new queen, those worker bees begin to lay. Now, obviously, they can't mate, and they're laying unfertilized eggs, and they're called haploid drones. So they're kind of this weird mutant drone that can't even mate or do anything. And so they'll start laying. They'll put multiple eggs in every cell, and there'll also be multiple worker bees laying. It's almost never worth it to try to saving a hive like that. Usually what we do is we just shake the bees out, reuse the frames, reuse the comb elsewhere, and move on. Now, if you just can't bring yourself to do that and you really want to try to save it, this works less than 50% of the time. But what you can do is you can take the box with all the bees in it, shake all the bees out 20 or 30 feet away from your hive, move the hive back, put all the frames back in place, give them a few frames of fresh new brood from a different hive, and put a new queen in that hive in a cage. Let the bees release it from the cage. And less than 50% of the time, that can work. The idea is you just shook all the bees out. Theoretically, those worker bees that were laying are too heavy to fly back to the hive, and you kind of get rid of all those worker bees that were laying, and you've installed a new queen. But again, it often doesn't work. But if you want to try, that's the best way to do it.